What happens when a life-saving doctor faces prejudice from the very patient she saved? Dr. Maya Johnson's story is one of resilience, compassion, and unexpected truths that will leave you speechless. A shocking revelation changes everything, proving that kindness has the power to break down even the deepest walls of prejudice. The hospital was alive with its usual rhythm, nurses hurrying through the halls, doctors consulting clipboards, and the hum of monitors filling the air. It was a place where urgency met hope, and lives hung in the balance every day. Among the chaos stood Dr. Maya Johnson, a figure of calm amidst the storm. Dr. Maya was known not just for her exceptional skill as a surgeon, but for her unyielding compassion. She had a warmth that reassured even the most anxious patients, and her dedication to her craft had earned her the respect of everyone she worked with. Her colleagues admired her, her patients trusted her. But behind her confident demeanor was a story that shaped the woman she had become. Maya grew up in a small, tightly knit community where her parents, both educators, instilled in her a deep sense of empathy and the value of hard work. Her mother often reminded her, "What you give to the world is what makes you extraordinary, not what you take." Maya carried those words like a compass. In medical school, she quickly rose to the top of her class, not because things were easy, but because she refused to give up. She had faced her share of prejudice along the way, microaggressions, doubts about her capabilities, but Maya turned every obstacle into fuel for her determination. To her, the Hippocratic Oath was more than words. It was a promise to see the humanity in everyone, regardless of their skin color, beliefs, or past actions. As she readied herself for another grueling day, Maya had no idea that the patient she was about to meet would test the very core of that promise. The hospital's emergency doors burst open as paramedics rushed in, wheeling a stretcher carrying an elderly woman. Blood stained the blankets covering her, and the urgency in their voices cut through the air. "Evelyn Carter, 72 years old," one paramedic called out. "Car accident, multiple fractures, suspected internal bleeding. BP is dropping." The trauma team sprang into action, their movements practiced and precise. Nurses called out vitals while monitors beeped with alarming irregularity. Mrs. Carter lay unconscious, her face pale and bruised, barely clinging to life. Dr. Maya Johnson was paged immediately. She arrived in the ER, her presence commanding yet calm. She assessed the situation in seconds, her sharp eyes scanning the monitors and the paramedics' notes. "Prep her for surgery," she said firmly. "We need to stop the bleeding now." The team moved quickly under her direction. As they wheeled Mrs. Carter into the operating room, Dr. Maya's mind worked through the possibilities. Internal bleeding was tricky, hidden, dangerous, and unforgiving. It would take every ounce of skill and focus to save this woman's life. Inside the OR, Maya led the team with steady hands and unwavering confidence. The room was silent, except for the rhythmic sound of the ventilator and the occasional updates from the anesthesiologist. Maya's hands moved deftly, repairing torn vessels and stabilizing fractures. Time seemed to stretch and contract as they worked tirelessly. Finally, after hours of painstaking effort, Maya looked up and declared, "Bleeding's under control. She's stable for now." The tension in the room lifted, replaced by quiet relief. Maya let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The battle wasn't over, but for the moment, Mrs. Carter had a fighting chance. The morning after surgery, Mrs. Carter slowly regained consciousness. Her eyelids fluttered open, and she scanned the room, her gaze eventually landing on Dr. Maya, who stood at her bedside with a warm, professional smile. "You're awake," Maya said softly. "That's a good sign. The surgery went well, we stopped the bleeding, and you're stable now." Mrs. Carter blinked, her voice weak, but grateful. "Thank you, doctor. I thought I wasn't gonna make it." "You're strong," Maya replied. "We'll focus on your recovery now. You're in good hands." But as Mrs. Carter's eyes adjusted and she took a closer look at Maya, her expression changed. The gratitude faded, replaced by something colder. Confusion, perhaps even disdain. She hesitated before speaking, her voice sharper now. "I didn't realize." Mrs. Carter's words trailed off before she muttered, "They let anyone be a doctor these days, don't they?" The comment hung in the air like a sudden chill. A nearby nurse froze mid-step, her face a mix of shock and discomfort. Another staff member busied themselves with a clipboard, avoiding eye contact. Dr. Rhett. Maya felt the sting of the remark, but her face remained composed. She'd encountered prejudice before, and while it hurt every time, she had learned to rise above it. Taking a deep breath, she chose to ignore the comment. "Rest is crucial for your recovery," Maya said gently. "If you need anything, let the nurse know. I'll check on you later." As she left the room, the staff exchanged uneasy glances, their admiration for Maya's grace evident. She walked down the hallway, her mind calm, knowing her dignity would always outshine ignorance. Mrs. Carter's recovery was slow, and as part of her follow-up care, the hospital reached out to her family. A few days later, a young woman arrived at the nurse's station, looking slightly nervous but determined. She introduced herself as Rachel, Mrs. Carter's granddaughter. Rachel was polite and soft-spoken as she approached Dr. Maya, her expression warm but tinged with embarrassment. "Dr. Johnson," she began, her voice steady. "I just wanted to thank you for everything you've done for my grandmother. She's not always the easiest person, but we're truly grateful you saved her life." Maya nodded, her professionalism unwavering. "Your gratitude means a lot. She's stable, but she'll need ongoing care and support." As they spoke, Rachel hesitated, glancing around to ensure privacy. Then, with a deep breath, she leaned in slightly. "I don't know if I should tell you this," she said softly, "but there's something about my grandmother, something she's hidden her entire life." Maya furrowed her brow, curious but cautious. Rachel continued, her voice a mix of sadness and resolve. "My grandmother was adopted as a baby. Her biological mother was black. She grew up in a white family in a time when, well, being mixed race wasn't accepted. She spent her whole life pretending that part of her didn't exist." Maya's expression remained calm, but a flicker of understanding crossed her eyes. Rachel's revelation explained a lot: the bitterness, the denial, the cutting remark. It wasn't just ignorance, it was a life shaped by rejection and fear. Rachel sighed, her face clouded with regret. She doesn't talk about it, but it's shaped everything about her. Maybe this is something she needs to face now. Later that evening, Rachel sat beside her grandmother's hospital bed, the room quiet except for the soft beeping of monitors. Mrs. Carter, her face lined with both age and the weight of recent events, regarded Rachel with curiosity. "You've been here all day, dear," Mrs. Carter said, her voice frail but sharp. "What's on your mind?" Rachel hesitated but knew the time had come. "Grandma, there's something I need to talk to you about," she began, her voice steady. "It's about your past, your adoption." Mrs. Carter's expression darkened immediately. "What are you talking about? I've told you everything you need to know." "No, you haven't," Rachel replied firmly. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder, placing it gently on the bedside table. "I found these when I was going through family papers, adoption records, photos. Your biological mother's name was Margaret Williams." Rachel paused before adding, "She was black, Grandma." Mrs. Carter's face tightened, her hands gripping the blanket. "That's nonsense," she snapped. "I was raised in a good, respectable family. This is some mistake." "It's not a mistake," Rachel said gently, opening the folder to reveal faded photographs of a young woman with unmistakable features. "This is Margaret. She's your mother." Mrs. Carter's breath hitched, her eyes fixated on the images. Her carefully constructed identity, the one she had clung to for decades, began to crack. "I didn't have a choice," she murmured, tears welling up. "They told me to forget, to never speak of it." Rachel reached for her hand. "Grandma, you've spent your whole life running from this, but it's part of who you are, and it doesn't make you any less worthy of love." Mrs. Carter remained silent, her face etched with a mix of shame, sorrow, and confusion. The truth was undeniable, but accepting it would be her hardest battle yet. The next morning, Dr. Maya entered Mrs. Carter's room, carrying a calm presence as always. Mrs. Carter looked up, her eyes red and puffy, the weight of the previous day's revelations etched deeply into her face. "Dr. Johnson," Mrs. Carter began, her voice trembling. I don't know what to say." Maya pulled up a chair and sat beside her. "You don't have to say anything right now. I just wanted to check on you, not just as a patient, but as a person." Mrs. Carter's lips quivered, and she let out a shaky sigh. "I've been so wrong," she admitted, tears slipping down her cheeks. "All my life, I've hidden who I am. I thought if I buried it deep enough, no one would know, not even me." Maya nodded, her gaze steady but gentle. "You grew up in a world that made you feel you had to hide. That must have been so hard. Mrs. Carter looked at her, her voice breaking. And then I treated you so poorly. You saved my life, and I... She stopped, unable to continue. Maya leaned forward, her tone soft but resolute. We all carry pain, Mrs. Carter. And sometimes that pain makes us hurt others even when we don't mean to. But what matters now is how you choose to move forward. Mrs. Carter sobbed openly, her frail hands reaching for Maya's. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Maya held her hand gently, her heart full of empathy. It's never too late to start healing, for yourself and for those who love you. In that moment, the walls of prejudice and pain began to crumble, replaced by a glimmer of understanding and hope. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the hospital, the events of the past few days lingered in the minds of everyone involved. Mrs. Carter's story was more than a patient's recovery. It became a poignant reminder of the complexities of human nature and the enduring power of compassion. Dr. Maya Johnson returned to her office, her day far from over. Yet she allowed herself a moment to reflect. Saving lives was her job, but healing hearts and challenging minds, that was the work of something greater. She had faced ignorance with dignity, and in doing so, she'd planted a seed of change in Mrs. Carter's heart. The lesson was clear. Kindness is not weakness, it's strength. It has the power to bridge divides, to soften the hardest of hearts, and to illuminate truths buried under layers of prejudice and fear. Dr. Maya knew that confronting bias, whether in others or within oneself, was uncomfortable, even painful. But it was also necessary. Growth never came without discomfort. The hospital staff had witnessed something remarkable. They saw not just a doctor saving a life, but a woman showing grace under fire, turning an act of hate into an opportunity for healing. It left an impression on all of them, a quiet ripple of inspiration that would spread in ways none of them could yet see. For Dr. Maya, this was more than another case. It was a reminder of why she'd chosen this path. As she walked down the quiet halls toward her next patient, she carried with her a quiet hope that every act of compassion could be a catalyst for change, one life at a time. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey today. If this story touched your heart or made you think about the impact of kindness, we'd love for you to be part of our community. Please take a moment to subscribe so you never miss another story that challenges the way we see the world. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. And if you know someone who could benefit from this story, be sure to share it with them. Together, we can spread the message of empathy, healing, and change. Thanks for being here, and we hope to see you in the next one.